1.
I press my weakened knee upon the ground and cry the call, for I would know your shadow on my brow, blossoming, and sense the arcane things endow my mundane mind with ceremonial task, rich ritual, the pleasures of demonic design. I cry for they who come to press mouths upon my eyes, beneath which they sink, so as to suck my burning brain from out its dungeon, my smooth skull. Allow me to let loose this essence of mortality that welds me to this world, this earth. Then let me crawl into some cosmic place where weakened limbs are demodés, where pangs of fleshy pain are but a jest bequeathed by mirthless gods. I will dance as I eschew oxygen for that other element. Yet I, still pressed upon this solid ground, cannot ascend unto yon floating clouds, and my one task is to claw into the mud in which I write your immemorial name, the name that once more I call to those dark clouds, with mouth that sucks in the current of this paltry age. I ache to suck a rarer clime, where I can drift as acolyte of smoke among the nightmares of an alien dimension, where earth and its happy doom is but a memory that makes me chuckle into the void, the endless abyss in the gulf of night where I would waft with chilly cosmic tempests that is the exhalation from your maw, that mouth with which you speak my mortal name, and claim me as your own. 2. I cannot see the flowers at my feet, the emblems of remembrance at my tomb, for smoke and shadow cloud what once were eyes, but I can sense the soft bouquet of rose, and smell the wilted lily's rank decay. I drift through wakeless air on buoyant feet, until I find again the gems that were your eyes, jewels that burn with self-substantial fire, ignition that pronounces you a god, embedded in your basalt eidolon. I fall to shattered knee on polished floor of one posthumous place, a floor that is littered by the remembrance of flowers from your once living devotee. She could not last forever. Had I lips, I would moan your name as a dark psalm, the name I almost seem to recollect, that once I whispered in the realm of life. Although we both are dead, dread Lord, I heard your uncanny call in termination's dusk, and from my final slumber I awakened, to rise from rotted wood and strata of earth, to you, and to a memory of life. I thought in death to become a thing of air, lifted from the elements of time, but I am still a creature of debris, transformed into neglected dust and mud. Like you, I am forgotten and bereft. Like you, I find no solace in the worm. To you I would exhale liturgical utterance, and clasp my hands in unholy solitude. Yet I am but a puppet of the grave, animated by your alchemy, and all that I can offer you, dread Lord, is veneration of a hollow heart, and veneration from a mouth of filth that falls more apart with each impotent whimper, until I am returned to my filthy bed, where I will worship you, if I am able, wrapped with worms. 3. I breathe into the fitful air as the alchemy of consumption has begun, as all my physicality wastes away, as I become an element of air, until I am an exhalation lifting to the skies, a vapour in a draught of wind. As I evaporate into the clouds, like some meditation on mortality, I take on the aspect of a whispered word that may, by chance, be nothing but a name that one may whisper in a prayer to some strange thing beyond sane dimension. A power pulsing in between the stars, into which my essence is inhaled. I filter through the clouds now wet with rain, like some forgotten word once writ on water, forgotten by the faces far below that opened their mouths so as to drink the downpour. mouths that cannot remember me with speaking. And thus I drift in an anonymous void, like some sad ghost that has lost its earthly hold, and fly toward the thing that, pulsing, sucks me into nothingness divine. And there I am surrounded by rare sparks, ignition that issues from a flaming throne, where chaos chatters idiotically, and the strange dark one offers me a pipe, which taking I press to malformed mouth, so as to join the disturbance that makes the dark air tremble, the psalm of sound that will go on and on, beyond the death of time. 4. We climb the haunted hill to its highest tip, to one place where memory is entombed beneath the clouds, those clouds that seem to form fantastic beings who watch our secret play. The thing reclines upon the tabletop tomb where once it ate, where once it had been eaten, long ago. Its hollow bones are blanched by burning sun. We remove the dust of time from off the bones with our unhallowed tongues, the dust that is not bitter to the taste, and we remember, vaguely, the flavour of sweet, soft flesh, partaken beneath the silent, watchful clouds, the flesh on which we dined so long ago, devoured in remembrance of our gods. The book of ritual is clasped in hand of bone, the book he held at time of sacrifice. You take it from his frail fossilized hand as I move my lips to that cavity that was his mouth, and housed the tongue that moved with ours in praise to they who dwell above us in the clouds. You take the book of ritual in hand and speak the words that turn the white sun red, as the bones beneath me crumble into dust, as I recline upon the tabletop slate and turn to gaze into demonic sky, as your sweet mouths clamp onto my tissue and pay homage to our gods. 5. An arsenical moon, disrobed of clouds, hangs in suicidal sky, and I drink that moon like laudanum, and sprinkle into its nectar crushed pearls of starlight. I take that horned moon and slit the wrist of heaven, and smell the seepage of cosmic blood that taints the scent of night. I conjure forth the wind that soughs through dancing trees, and sounds like the rustling of purple satin curtains that hide my antics from the dreary crowd. I seep between those curtains and stalk the night in memory of you, Matteo, beneath that vaulted tomb, the sky. I take your spectral hand, my lovely lad, and kiss it with pale lips on which passion has cooled, but that remember still your taste. I pray to you, my deity of love, and dance with memory in the lost places one can only find in dream. Sing to me, Matteo, my deity of sorrow, so that I may follow your voice through mortal air, unto a place of ghosts that know nothing of unwanted passion. 6. I step into the subterranean place and breathe chthonic air that still contains a memory of that which oozed from your infernal prehistoric lungs. I sense the recollection of your home, that darker planet deep in cosmic void, unadorned by glow of moon or star, from which you fell through non-dimensional space and time to sleepy mud beneath our ancient hill. I find it here, upon your obsidian dais, among the jewels that have never known the light of dawn, and marvel at the expert articulation that may be uttered by an artifact. I shine my torch unto your representation, and sense that you recoil from the touch of ersatz illumination that filters artificially through darkness. I kill the light, and see you with my senses, as the gems that are my eyes adjust to darkness, wherein I see things in a different fashion, as I suck in air that reeks of your bequeathed diseases, and as I peer into the air of this dimension, the place begins to shape itself anew, until I understand that I now stand within the ebon caverns of Nkai, in which I bow my altered form. no longer human now but serpentine, and weep your praises with my dying breath. 7. How queer those things that one can sense in darkness. It is not imagination, it is not, I fear, even madness, and memory, or its tatters, is a damnation that threatens to grow unambiguous. I recall the scent of morning, mostly sweet and succulent like meadow dew, yet tainted slightly by an indistinct debauch. I remember my first sight of blurry dawn as weighty lids arose, meekly and minutely. There is recollection of muted yet excited voices, of the faces of men that take on solid outline as the light that spills in through high windows caught the features of these fellows. I did not deign to open my eyes too widely, unused as they were to earthly light, nor did I shift as one of the mortals bent over me with a chilly apparatus, one part of which he placed against my chest, as its other end was fastened to his ear. How distasteful it was to be touched and violated, but my limbs proved stiff and heavy, and would not move in protest beneath mortal hands, nor could I split my mouth in protest as a needle was injected yet again into my heart, as something from within that implement flowed through me, something smooth and cool and sinister. Rough mortal hands clutched at me, and I was lifted from the surface on which I reclined, carried some little distance, and then dropped into an uncouth pit, from which I could discern the fragrance of freshly violated earth. Words, muttered in discouragement and anger, faded, and I sensed that I had been abandoned in the lonesome place. The blur of hateful day grew more intense as it blazed from the high wide windows, and the ghouls who were my guardians did not return. More and more the burning liquid that had been injected into my heart pumped through my veins, and thus I was invigorated. With a sense of doubtful liberation I clutched at the walls of my pit, and pushed hands into its sediment, where I found enough of a hold so that I could pull myself onto my knees. My eyes now fully functioned, and with them I scrutinized the floor of earth around me, and its other crude pits, some of which were hideously inhabited. There were tables and their implausible instruments, the sight of which brought nagging memory to mind, of a place where I had laboured in stealth, in some secret chamber, combining powders and fluids as I uttered incantations from the Atlo tablets. I saw within my mind's depth the beings of another realm that had answered my incantations, creatures that were not angelic. These fiends pushed against my moving mouth and stole my mortal exhalation, until sensation expired and sentient darkness wove around and through me. Time transformed, and soon I smelled the muted light of new dawn, and lifting my face to that soft light, I experienced renewed strength, and crawled out of the shallow indentation into which the ghouls had tossed me. Creeping to a vast wooden vat that squatted on naked earth, I curled my fingers around its rim so as to regain threatened balance. And as I clutched that rim, I studied the unnatural blanched pastiness of my hands, soiled as they had been by earth's debris. I steadied on painful knees, and bent over the vat's wooden rim. I watched the white reflection of the ghastly thing I had become as it wavered in the vat's liquid, wavered because my shuddering was shaking the wooden tub. I shook because I was a thing that should not, or should no longer, exist. O bleached and bony countenance, what horror you portend! What breach of sanity! For I was a madness out of time, disrupted in my final rest by the fluid that had been injected into my diseased heart. My mouth then found its voice, and I whimpered at my fate. Uneasily I stood, Ungainly, I stalked to a door and shook it from its hinges, then tramped upon it as it crashed onto the ground. Unnaturally, I breathed, and the sound of that exhalation was conjoined with a groan of unutterable misery. I walked until the yellow sky darkened and a bloated moon appeared, a fungal chimera deep within an abyss of night. I walked instinctively until I found the plot from which I had been robbed. The ground of my grave had been smoothed, its desecration concealed. I tried to speak the name that had been etched onto my tombstone, but naught slipped from my mouth except a gag of woe. When I dropped onto the ground, my fingers found their way homeward into the earth. The smell of displaced sod began to soothe me, and as I worked I tried to sing a memory of magic that was one portion of the Aklo formulae, with which, in other existence, I communed with deities of rarest air. And the sound of my strangled voice lifted to the fungal moon, which was soon camouflaged by shapes that were not clouds, fiends that fell to me. They wove around and through me as I reclined within my new-made pit, as I pulled the displaced silt over me, until it covered me completely. 8. Looking inward, she saw naught but phantoms, fiends that, churning, laced her heart with doom. She did not mind that this was so, for she had wearied of humanity and its unhappy world, where in delusion its inhabitants danced and warbled of nothing beneath their expiring sun. She loathed them and their senseless frolic, and hated the way their sunlit faces condemned her malcontent. They could never comprehend her, and thus she felt kinship with fiends alone, those things of smoke and madness that churned around her brain and sank into her heart, where they taught that organ deadlier palpitation. And thus she secreted herself in one lonesome place, a place of death where happy mortals were disinclined to play, and there she danced with vines of willow trees, and sang to startled bats, and answered the baying that drifted to her on the midnight wind, the howling of some unearthly thing that hungered for blood and tears. She danced, accompanied by her shadowed fiends, those comrades that melted into her heart and taught it deceleration, an alien palpitation that pulsed inside her throat and lifted to the back of her eyes to which were revealed an obscure realm where dreams festered and became merrily diseased. She floated on demoniac tempest which lifted her to a high wall on which she balanced beneath a foggy violet welkin, and through mists that were the miasmal pants of devils she watched one star, the name of which she might once have known but had forgotten, and thus she could not call to it. Yet still its dim refraction bent the air above her, so that shadows, falling, took her hands and guided her along the wall, until they reached a place where a sluggish river wound its lethargic way. Her shadows held her as she jumped from off the wall and landed near the bridge that crossed the river, could cross so as to journey to the distant paddock beneath a violet heaven, and to the antediluvian tower of blanched stone that tilted over that eerie meadow. She skipped across the bridge, and danced toward the tower, which rose from earth like some prehistoric relic of bone, and she marvelled at how that tower shimmered beneath the violet heaven, as if its substance drank the illumination that leaked from the demon star. She smiled and kissed the tower's rock, and entered the arched threshold that led within the edifice, to circular steps that rose toward violet heaven and its single star. She climbed to the upper reaches and found one large and lonely window, through which she leaned toward chill infinity. And as she scanned the sky, her inner fiends ceased their churning and spilled from out her eyes, leaking into the violet abyss above her, toward the demon star, that sphere from which there fell one silver beam that served as path into the gulf of night. And on that path she stepped, dancing toward the star that diffused with the shadows of her fiends, in whose quiet conclave she would find rare dreams and darkness eternal. 9. Where can I learn the doctrine of the mask? I seem to sense it in voltage of the sky, where fissures of fire split the gulf of night and almost spell your name. I watch the electric show as those streams of lightning fall toward the expanse of water into which I wade. The lightning that flashes so as to reveal your black visage there, where once a moon arose. Innsmouth, with her unnumbered crimes, sleeps behind me. I walk amongst the antique wooden buoys, those markers on which curious hand-carved faces watch my stride. The green illumination of your eyes is reflected on the water through which I amble, the water that tingles with the kiss of your electric show. Peering into the depths, I see the other eyes of deep things far below, and I see the mouths below those eyes that would part and drag me under with their siren's song. Have you devoured the moon, that mistress of the tides? Your black facade is like a magnet to my blood, and I pulled deeper there into the depths where your cruel visage is reflected. It drifts to me on the water, your mask of manifestation, and I would lift it to me, but the liquid of which it is composed spills through my fingers. How can I don the doctrine of your mask and be your child? That is my deepest dream. Perhaps if I sink beneath the surface, just below your veneer of mockery, I can then lift upward, out of water, with your features melted into mine own. But that is a mistake, for as I sink beneath the surface, I hear at last the liquid song of they who hunger for my mortal soul. Their clamour rises, claiming me as a whirlpool of inhuman echo, and you, above, smile and scorn at the centre of the liquid vortex, adorned by the chiselled faces of the antique boys. X. I thought to adore you, beast of the godless valley, and sing your psalms to haunted shadow. A haunting sound. I am intoxicated by your scent, the cloying sweetness that is a manifestation of this realm, a fragrance that is embedded in your hair, your hands, your mouth. Oh, the hunger you inspire, the rush of blood and quake of bones. Yet you allow me to worship from a distance only, after your initial seduction, and your indifference serves to flame my need, so that I fall onto my knees among the haunted shadow, and sink my fingers into the soil that shares your scent. I lift that mud, and wash it over my visage, and wear it as a mask of fragrant filth. And that is when you kneel before me, and smile with silver eyes, as you whisper secrets to the hungry sky, the sky that clouds with shapes that adore you more than I. And as those airy outlines in the sky sing your psalms with unsubstantial moors, your aromatic hands work the soil of my mask. And it is strange to be so moulded and malformed. I do not mind, for when you grace me with the nearness of your perfumed face, I see what I have become there, on the surface of your silver eyes. And I know that, now adopted by the veil, I shall dwell with you forever. 11. To our porphyry tombs, dear Robbie, and to the worm. We sat in Oscar's enchanting garden, beneath an autumn moon, and I tapped my glass of absinthe to his. To love, and to its loss, I counted, and he momentarily frowned, then shrugged and drank the elixir. Love is often a tomb in which the heart is trapped, he offered, gnawed by that foul worm, passion. I am happy to be aged, and to have put all of that nonsense behind me. How joyous to peep at that far moon and not have to sigh for romance! What happiness to feel in one's heart the chilliness of that supernal sphere of dust, and to share in her frigidity, in this 11th hour of my mortality. So you say. He frowned and squinted suspiciously. I smiled. Yet you still adore the form of youth that drove you to insanity in former days, or so your recent acquisition would suggest, for there he stands among the mauve and purple hyacinth, a dark phantom of male perfection. Oscar did not deign to turn and study the object of which I spoke. Rather, setting down his glass, he opened his cigarette case and took up an opium-tainted cylinder of shredded tobacco. I refused when he offered me to select my own. Yes, he stands there as those lovely flowers dance in this mild autumn zephyr. His figure is sublime, but you have failed to notice his most singular feature. Have I? Moving out of my chair, glass in hand, I walked down the little path that took me to the spot where the figure had been planted. I assumed it was made of smooth and polished wood that had been stained so as to give it its hue of utter blackness. I guessed it to be 5 feet in height, and the taut perfection of its figure made clear that its model had been a superb Adonis of an athletic kind. It is of Greek or African origin, I told my host. Its pose is certainly interesting. It seems a haughty stance, and the one uplifted arm rather demands the adoration of one's mouth, commanding to be kissed. How peculiar that it was left unfinished. My back was to Oscar, and so I could not see if he would rise to join me. I heard his exhalation, and smelled the perfumed smoke that drifted to me on the wind. Why do you assume it is unfinished? I rotated and returned to where he sat. Because you have always had an obsession for the face of perfect handsomeness. There is no visage on that effigy of wood. There is naught but a smooth and perfect blankness, a void of features. Could not such a void prove symbolic? Quietly I laughed. Of what? Did his facelessness not suggest anything to you, dear Robbie? Snuffing out his cigarette, he rose and wandered to the figure. Do you not notice how there is an aspect of listening in his haughty tilt of head, as if the void where his face should be is an audient thing that awaits our whispered veneration? And did you not notice the little points of light that play upon his void, almost indiscernible, but fathomed none the less? When one studies them carefully, one can see that they are the reflections of those gathered stars, just there in the gulf of night, that peculiar pattern of cosmic points that hang so suggestively in night's abyss. What nonsense you talk, Oscar. And then the alcohol got to me and triggered a dull ache within the fissure in my skull. Silently my friend observed me, and then he sallied to me and placed his white-gloved hand against my forehead. He loved to touch the place of abnormal absence just beneath my face. It feels more pronounced, this split in your frail skull, extending like a fissure on some house of usher. Do take your mitten away, old thing. You needn't analyze my infirmity. I can feel its expansion, from the roof of my dome to the cellar of my soul, for it is more than a physical cleft, and like poor Roderick I can hear its division in my pit of psyche. In time it will grow so wide that my brain will wash its fluid to my eyes, and in that vision I will behold my death. So fill your glass again, my friend, and let us toast our perishability.
Enough. Death is wonderful as a poetic toy, but its reality is too dull for words. Let us not speak of terminations, for that is not dead which may linger for an eternity, beneath the earth, the sea, or deep within some unknown gulf of night. No, do not frown on me with your dark, suspicious eyes. I do not jest, nor am I a drunken sphinx with riddles to unravel. You know that I returned some little time ago from the Côte d'Ivoire, from which I appropriated yon mythic eidolon. I learned of it in Al-Azif, a kaleidoscope of allegorical poetry, the author of which has been deemed mad by undiscerning minds. I ascertained where I would find the faceless icon of which I began to dream. To absorb Al-Azif is to realize dreams such as one has never known. And in those visions of this nameless icon I saw that it too dreamt of me. Our dreaming coalesced hideously, and in those visions I heard the song that was chanted to the faceless icon, its psalms of adoration that were mouthed by lesser deities of strangest air. The language of that ritual clings to my brain with such intensity that I feel my skull, like yours, must split. In one queer dream I danced before the icon, and from above there issued a panorama of electric streams that, flashing brightly, revealed the forms of faces that blossomed and withered on the surface where the icon wore no countenance. And among those fleeting physiognomies, momentarily, I beheld your own.
Al-Azif. Such a queer sound, those words, especially as spoken on your tongue, for you say them as only a poet can, endowing them with a potency of language.
As if designates a peculiar sound associated with nocturnal insects, or what might be mistaken as insects. That is a local legend in the land where the mad Arab penned his lines and diagrams. Perhaps it is a drone that you can only hear in dream, and yet perhaps, as our reality influences what we dream, perhaps the devils that dream of us influence our existence.
You've lost me entirely, old thing. He shrugged.
Old I am, but there are others, great old things that dream in rare dimension, and in their dreams they smell our mortal blood, that rare elixir that is especially to this globe. They are enticed by smell of blood and the repast of which it promises, and so they seek us out in our dreaming and our lunacy, manifesting themselves in secret ceremony and fantastic art. They motivated some savage to sculpt that esoteric icon from some trunk of tree.
He looked at me so oddly.
They inspired me to summon you here tonight, so that I may spill into your ear the language of their alchemy.
Have you ever enunciated this foreign language?
In dream alone.
And how we speak in dream can be so peculiar. Things happen in a nap, with our eyelids closed, that we think consume a day, yet are the matter of mere seconds. How fanciful earthly time can be in realm of slumber.
Then let us dream while wide awake.
Oscar sighed as he took me in his arms. I stood very still as he pressed his lips against my ear, into which he uttered alien lexis. I heard that utterance coil around my brain, and then it seemed to spill out from the fissure in my skull into the upper ether. And from that height I heard the language spoken by other tongues, as a song of infernal buzzing,
and between the phrases I heard the spoken name of Nyarlathotep, a name that shook the firmament. And I saw a cloud assemble in the heavens, black and nebulous, shifting its form until it resembled the wooden statue of my friend. It billowed to me from the air, surrounded by its devils, they who buzzed his name in adoration. And then the droning horde fell to me and melted through my face. They found the fissure in my cranium and entered in, and I clasped my hands to my ears in an attempt to stop their whirring pulsation. I shut my eyes so as to block the phantom in the sky and its supernal mockery. But this was a mistake, for suddenly my identity clouded, became doubtful. Was I standing in the garden of my poetic friend, or was I whirling inside my skull with a demon horde to which I had conjoined? Why did I remember impossible things, alien and incredible scenes beneath the combustion of violet suns, cyclopean cylinders of rotting stone that tilted over fungus vegetation? Another devil spoke the majestic name, a rapacious lunatic who usurped my place in infamy. Oscar pushed me from the hand that the fluctuating form of Nyarlathotep was offering me, and as I toppled onto his garden, he bent to that cosmic hand and licked it. And then he howled, but only once, for as he wailed his features melted from him, and without his mouth he could no longer utter sound. I watched him fall next to me, into his hyacinths, as his body boiled and burned and blackened. And then at last he extinguished, a black and faceless thing, to which I crawled, and over which I wept. 12. I crept like a frightened girl on silver-sandaled feet beneath an arc of moonlight, toward the house of shadows. The street of sorrow on which I tiptoed was as hard as cold reality. I was eager to be off it, and so I rushed to the porch when I beheld it, and hopped on to its first step with a relish of satisfaction. But my pleasure was short-lived, for as I skipped up the wooden steps I encountered a splinter that drove into my heel. Thus wounded, I limped through the threshold into the edifice. The hallway was very dark, except for sad phosphorescent faces that floated here and there along the low ceiling and provided the single source of light. I stopped to rest my stinging foot, and leaned against a tall grandfather clock, resting my head against its mirrored door and listening to its pulse. And as I rested I watched the blanched face that, floating to the clock, kissed its own reflection on the polished glass. The ticking from behind that glass extinguished, and time became extinct. But then I heard another rhythm that sounded from behind one nearest door. Stepping to that door, I turned its knob and entered into a spacious chamber that vibrated with music that was performed by a band of mechanical grotesques. Masked gigolos moved in solitary dance around a small fountain that gurgled in the middle of the room. I laughed at their clumsy movement, and at the sound of my derision one figure jerked toward me, and as it studied me in the chamber's artificial light, I could see that its whorish limbs were made of wood, smooth and white. Reaching out, I removed its pallid mask so as to reveal the puppet countenance, a physiognomy so smooth and fine and handsome that I could not resist tilting to it and pressing my lips to its unyielding mouth. Lifting the pallid mask above me, I marvelled at its beguiling velvetiness, and I could not resist lowering it onto my face and pressing it against my tingling flesh, to which it sensuously adhered. The handsome puppet took my hands and waltzed me to the fountain in the middle of the room, and I laughed merrily until I looked down into the water, for beneath that liquid surface I saw a bloated thing
that I recognized as a boy I once had loved, then tossed aside. He had been an elf of bewitching beauty, but addiction and ennui had debauched his loveliness and made him dull. I met him one last time on a bridge over a slow-moving river, where I whispered in moonlight that our love affair was over. Turning away from him, I whistled at the moon, but soon I heard a splashing sound, and looking down I saw a white sphere floating beneath the river water, and I knew that it was the submerged and lifeless face of my discarded lover. It bobbed once out of the water, so that his dark, liquid eyes gazed at me one last time, and then the current pulled him down and out of view. A wooden mouth pressed against my hair, and then my ear, and heaved in an artificial voice my lover's name, and yet I could not turn my eyes away from the phantom image in the fountain, and so I saw the dead bloated face arise and open its mouth, from which a stream of slime escaped. And I became furious, for I had escaped into the house of shadows so as to escape sordid reality, yet here it was before me, risen as a swollen corpse that hungered for my kiss. I backed away from the cruel fountain and pushed the handsome dummy from me, and then I rushed to the doorway and fled the monstrous chamber. I ran up carpeted stairs, into an upper region where I encountered a soft golden radiance that was like nothing known in harsh actuality. I sighed to that happy light, and followed it into another room that was furnished with exquisite antiques. Smiling, I approached one upright mirror and winked at my image, that was cased within the arch of golden filigree into which the mirror had been fitted. Foolishly I began to caper before my double, wincing only slightly at the recurring throb of pain in my wounded heel, when it struck too haughtily the floor. Yet I could not dance for long, because I grew so easily exhausted, and this perplexed me until I peered again into the pool of glass, and saw my withered eidolon. How could the aged, decrepit creature in that mirror be me, with those bags below its rheumy eyes, its sagging flesh and scarecrow hair? I could not comprehend it. And then my reflection did not dwell alone, and I sensed the form beside me, no longer a drowned and bloated husk of tiresome flesh, but a chilly, solid reality that touched its hands to my hair. I watched in the mirror as his mouth kissed my hair, my throat, my breast. He lowered to his knees and kissed my foot, at which his fingers worked until, smoothly, he plucked the sharp sliver of wood from my heel. And then he rose before me one last time, the boy I had once adored and ruthlessly debauched, and a lovely little smile played on his lips, and he touched those lips to mine as he pushed the sharp, sharp splinter through my chest into my heart. 13. I disengage from Legion and swim through black clouds to where the woman hangs, the crone who adored me with magic and mayhem before her filthy murder. She dangles now from length of hempen rope, as below her in semicircle bay the green-eyed ghouls who were her pack. I used to hear her croon to them, in my spaces between the stars, and watched her share in their ghastly repast. I saw her kiss their eyes, those moonlit eyes that were of a similar shade to her green orbs. I float before them now, her wide and lifeless eyes, and kiss them with my devil breath, an exhalation to which her dead mouth lifts, and as her lips begin to curl with reanimation, the fire from my eyes cinders the rope on which she hangs. From some distant place behind me the scene is ruptured by a flash of false light, an element that I do not understand. No matter. The fire from my eyes has flayed the hempen rope from which she hangs, and thus she sallies from the gallows to the ground, and they who reach to catch her. I drift to her as cloud of demon smoke, and I melt into her flesh, and find new compartment in her heart, which beats to the rhythm of my enchantment. For there are times when we, insubstantial freaks of alien dimension, long to dwell within a mortal form, and we have found the easiest to reanimate are they who hang from gallows, or from isolated limbs in hidden forests, or from suicidal rafters in dreamers' attic. And thus we slip through elements beyond mortal imagination, to blend our spectres with this corporeal clime, and find the dead eyes of criminals and suicides, of they accused of witchcraft and other petty sins, and we evoke our reflected essence on those eyes until they blink and water with our alchemy, with life in death. And thus we teach stiff limbs to walk the earth again, to dance beneath the ghastly moon, as she dances now among her brood of ghouls. The noisome pack arises so as to lick her gnarled hands, and lift paws with which to soothe her broken neck. They do not seem to comprehend that it is another being that peers at them with her wild eyes. When at last I speak, it is with her harsh voice, and I lift her gnarled hands so as to make esoteric signals to the moon and bend the element of air. I have not forgotten that queer electric flash that rudely infiltrated the place earlier, and I am aware of the semi-human eyes that observe us from some hidden place, and I cackle as I use my alchemy so as to smooth and heal the hag's broken neck. I raise her reanimated eyes to the gallows on which she was murdered, and I spit my demon fire to that gibbet, and then dance with my ghouls as it is reduced to cinders. How delicious it was to have a material body of mortal flesh, to no longer be a thing of demonic ether, and to feel upon my newly inhabited form those aspects of this physical plane, the heat of flames with which the gallows had been destroyed, the chilly expulsion of canine breath from the mouths of my ghouls as they licked me, the taste of carnage on those fiendish mouths as my pack kissed me. I rubbed my desiccated hands over my arms, and pinched so as to feel the bone beneath. I sensed the world with mortal eyes, and worked the brain within its cranium, and from that brain I culled the wise woman's esoteric knowledge, her craft, with which she had been able to evoke storms and make herself invisible. It was this latter art that most intrigued me, and so I shut my eyes and spoke her remembered spell, and my ghouls bayed when I vanished from their view. With invisibility came another aspect, an enhancement of being one with earthly elements, and so I conjoined to rising gale and floated to the hidden place, wherein I found the one who was concealed. I spoke, and he rose from hiding and watched as I regained my solid form. I learned from dipping into his psyche that he was an artist of rare talent, and that the mechanical instrument that he wore around his neck was that with which he caught images with a form of modern alchemy. It was the instrument that had produced the rude flash of light that had earlier annoyed me. But more important than any of this were those aspects of his nature that he did not fully comprehend. His deep disturbance by the sight of my ghouls, and the longing that my pact aroused within some secret chamber of his soul. I lifted my withered hand so as to stroke his face, the face on which I saw Heredity's stamp that showed me what he was, a foundling that, with time, was stepping into genetic mutation of flesh and psyche. I would not explain this to him. He would realize all anon. I would give him but a taste of what in fact he was, what in time he would fully become. Tilting to him, I gave him her kiss, the brush of lips that she reserved for her especial brood. I kissed him as my pack raised their jade eyes, so like his own, and bayed to yellow moon. And I laughed as he, not understanding why, lifted his head to that lunatic satellite, and bayed also. 14. The party was not his kind of thing, but was given by his friend and collaborator that All Hallows Eve, and so Elias Coffin felt the need to attend, if only for a little while. The party's absurd theme, everyone had to dress as a character from a Vincent Price film, at first seemed absolutely puerile. But then he realized that he could take advantage of this theme to dress as a character from his favourite author, Poe. He paid an actress friend, who also had a private business as a seamstress, a small fortune to create a robe that was identical to that worn by Price in his beguiling role as the Red Death, and he had decided to wear crimson grease paint over his face rather than a mask. He found in a costume shop an excellent pair of red velvet gloves that would be the perfect final touch, and so he sauntered into the party at 10:33 p.m. and frowned at the array of unimaginative costumes, the one exception being a deliciously masculine woman who looked exactly as Price in his role of Roderick Usher. He danced with her for a little while, but she was obviously intoxicated, and people who drank bored him, so he made his escape to his friend's small office and its excellent library of weird fiction. He glanced with subdued envy at the title of those books his friend had written on his own. The Delver Underneath by Ephraim Kant, In the Vale of Shoggoth by Ephraim Kant, and so on, for solo production had been a trick that Elias had never mastered, and his one collection of stories written on his own, The Feaster from Afar and others, had yet to find an interested publisher. He had some few copies published at his own expense, bound in white vellum with title stamped in red, and he reached for the copy he had presented to his friend and cohort. He opened the book to that tale he considered his best, The Mask of Outer Madness, and began to read aloud its opening paragraph. During the entire dull day, as he lay within a pile of autumn leaves tinted gold, he had scanned the low oppressive cloud that seethed above him in the dark sky, and imagined that it formed a demon of amorphous dimension. He watched that monstrous cloud as the last remnant of daylight expired, and then he lifted out of leaves and proceeded on his way to the haunted church whose black steeple had been destroyed in last month's thunderstorm. At his first glimpse of it he suffered a pervasive gloom that saturated his soul with depression, for the bleak edifice seemed a personal comment on his wretched state of loneliness. And then, within the quiet of the room that knew only his whispered language, Elias heard another soft voice continue to speak the opening paragraph of his tale. And so he staggered, past the few white trunks of withered trees, with unearthly misery churning his little soul, as the mist of the moist ground rose to mask the building before him in a mauve haze that, as he breathed it in, seemed the very ether of damnation. He was so startled that he almost dropped the book, and this reaction caused a low, blithe voice to laugh. He turned and whispered, "Juliana," and at the name the beautiful woman genuflected, revealing a peek of the taut black breasts beneath the gown that replicated Hazel Court's costume in her final scene. Elias marvelled at the beauty of the necklace of white gold around the black woman's throat, at the upside-down cross of darker gold just above the bosom. She did not wear a veil-like headpiece as the actress had in the film, but rather let her abundance of rich red hair fall down past her shoulders, reaching to the small of her back. When she stood erect and gazed at him, the writer saw that her jade eyes were flecked with gold. "I've startled you," she sighed.
"In more ways than one," he responded. "Were you reading behind my back?"
"Not at all. I am intimate with your work."
She held out a hand.
"Marceline Rabelais."
He took her hand and kissed it, then repeated the name in a quiet voice, as he tried to recall where he had heard it. To assist him, the black beauty reached to a shelf and pulled a title from it.
"You've probably not read it,"
she told him, as she shrugged. He took the book and looked at its title stamped in black on the yellow board. The Stairway in the Crypt.
"I've not read it, but I have noticed it here, among Ephraim's books, and have actually pulled it down to scan its pages. He is going to loan it to me eventually. I didn't know you two were acquainted. You've not signed it for him."
"I never sign my name, an elder superstition. That is my one attempt at a work of length, but I admit it's a bit disjointed. More a collection of interconnected vignettes and prose poems than an actual novel. Yet the theme is consistent throughout."
"And is the title metamorphic? And is the crypt in fact a symbol of the human psyche, the depths of which we enter at our peril?"
She took the book from him and returned it to its place.
"In fact, the stairway leads upward into a little room. In life, I mean. The place that served as inspiration. You know of the shunned church on the hill?"
"You mean the one that lost its steeple in that violent storm of last summer? Yes, I can see it, actually, from my study window, although I live a little distance from it on another hill. Ephraim has told me of its haunted legend. Well, hinted of that legend, merely. I don't think he knows much about it, in fact. But now I understand his comment that had me rather mystified. That he wanted to set a story there, but that someone had beat him to it."
"He knows that he can still write his little tale, for I invented an alternative setting that no one would mistake for its inspiration. We were going to investigate it together, Ephraim and I, but once we actually stood near it, he became mentally disturbed. Spoke of the way the dark vapours of the neighbourhood were unnatural and sentient, and that the unwholesome odour of the place reminded him of a smell he experienced in a dream about his own tomb, and other nonsense. So we did not enter in, although I found that a back door was unlocked."
"And you did not return on your own?"
"Never in the waking realm, but I've been there, in my haunted dreams. Well, you came into this room to be alone, I think. You are not a social beast, as is our foolish friend. Good evening, Mr. Coffin."
He prepared to bow to her, but stopped as he experienced a bizarre and brief hallucination. As he gazed at her, the woman's face tilted just a little, as if it were a mask that had lost its hold. At the same time the entire room blurred around him, as if it belonged to a different dimension. Only the magnificent black woman before him kept a solid form. He shut his eyes momentarily, and when again he opened them, Miss Rabelais was gone, except for the phantom of her face, an image that seemed stained upon the window in the wall. But as he studied the image, it melted into night. 15. I cornered Ephraim and told him that I was leaving early due to a headache. He smiled at the lie, knowing my antisocial ways, and thanked me for deigning to show up at all. Holding up the stairway in the crypt, I asked if I could take it with me and keep it for a wee while. "Oh, sure. She's here, you know. Somewhere." He glanced around the room with intoxicated eyes. Kissing his cheek, I bade him adieu and went to wait for my cab. But as I took my seat and buckled up, I had a sudden impulse, and I gave the driver an address that was not my own.
I had the cabby drop me off some 10 blocks from the church.
"You gonna walk round the neighbourhood dressed like that?"
"I am indeed," I responded, giving him a handsome tip. "Happy Halloween." He shrugged and shook his head, and then drove off. I coughed at the expulsion of exhaust that billowed from his departing vehicle. The moon, half full, was accompanied by so many points of starlight, and the sight so enchanted me that I began to whistle as I walked. I held Miss Rablow's book to the half-moon's glow, and spoke its title to the stars. There was no cosmic response. No one was around, which I thought odd, it being a big party night. But as I looked around and observed the state of the houses that I passed, I decided this was an extremely poor neighbourhood, and perhaps a dangerous one as well, and that street life was kept to a minimum. It was a cool autumn evening, but I was so overdressed in my Poesque costume that I was quite comfortable, and I grinned at the idea of someone encountering me on the darkened street and their possible reaction to my guise. I reached out at the high fence of black iron that I passed, through which I could see a little courtyard and its fountain, and then I stopped. Before me a figure reclined on a rough brown stone bench. He was dressed in rags and shivered slightly as he slept, and I couldn't comprehend why his face looked so odd until I stepped nearer and saw the pennies that had been placed over his eyelids. I silenced my tune and shut my mouth, but after a little while the gentleman's lips compressed, and he himself began to whistle. Something about the sound filled me with slight panic, for in my wild imagination it seemed that the fellow wasn't whistling. I imagined that his sound was meant to serve as signal to some unseen thing. And my blood iced when, from some distant place, there came a low response of something howling to the moon.
"You come to take me home?"
He had lifted himself onto one elbow, and now held his pennies in one palm.
"I beg your pardon?" "I never seen you as dressed in red. Thought you'd be all black. Where's your coach?"
I understood. No, dear fellow, I am not that grim escort. I'm merely in costume, for a party I attended. I am Plague, Death's predecessor. I heard the trickling splash of fountain water, and began to move away, so as to enter the quadrangle.
"Take this," he called, handing me one of his pennies. "Make a wish."
Accepting his alms, I muttered my thanks and stepped into the courtyard, wherein the moon seemed subtly brighter, so that my flowing shadow preceded my stride. Floating to the fountain, I lowered onto its circular edge and peered into its pond. How strange that the mutated shadows of clouds floated beneath the water's surface. And how queer that one of those shadows looked familiar as it paused in its route to watch me. It was blacker than night, that sphere, and from one end a filigree of stringy crimson vines wavered in the water. Setting down my book, I removed my scarlet gloves and reached into the water. The thing I extracted from the depths was chilly to the touch, and disturbingly soft, and I did not fancy the way its flow of tendrils wrapped around one finger. I held her black visage to moonlight as it dried in risen wind, and I almost brought the full mouth to my own. She was beautiful and beguiling, and I could not resist bringing the mask of Marceline Rabelais to my face, and pressing its underside to my flesh, to which it sensuously cohered. The moon darkened in the gulf of night, as from some distant place a thing bayed to blackness. 16. He approached the Cyclopean building and drank its quality of bizarrerie, entranced by the wisps of thick mist with which the building was sheathed. Lifting his eyes, he peered through the eye-openings of his mask and studied the black tower at the building's height, which had not been repaired from the storm damage that had resulted in the destruction of the church steeple. A back door, unlocked, led him into a spacious cellar that was crowded with many disfigured and discarded statues of what he supposed were saints. They were a motley assembly now, with hands pressed together in prayer beneath faces that had in so many cases been shattered by some degree of violence. He climbed the worn wooden steps that took him upward, pushing aside the cobwebs with which the cellar was festooned. Reaching the ground floor, Coffin ignored the impulse to check out the nave and sanctuary, and found the spiral staircase that took him up to what he imagined to be the bell tower. He absent-mindedly noticed that this section of the building was free of grime and spider mesh, and he wondered why the temperature so increased as he climbed. Now and then he passed by murky windows, through which he glanced so as to view the hill on which he had an apartment from which, in twilight's violet half-light, he could see the church and its ruined tower. He could see nothing now except a vague hint of blurring points of electric light in the distance. He reached at last the tower room, a space of 15 square feet of 5 walls, and on each wall there was an austere lancet window, the glass of which was so sooty that he could not see through them. On a table near the entranceway he found an antique oil lamp that lacked its glass chimney, and it thrilled him, as he struck a match and touched its flame to the wick, to see that the old thing still functioned and contained fuel. In the middle of the room stood an irregularly angled stone pillar 4 feet in height, on which had been chiselled curious alien hieroglyphs. On this pillar rested an obsidian statuette of a figure that seemed attired in Egyptian fashion, and donned a Nemes headcloth, such as was worn by pharaohs. Peculiarly, the figurine had no face. He ran a finger against the smooth surface that lacked visage, and realized that he had left his scarlet gloves at the courtyard's fountain. Coffin went to the place where a small bookcase leaned, set down his lantern and Miss Rablot's book. He frowned at the titles of the tomes he found there on the leaning bookcase, weighty volumes that coated his naked hands with debris when he picked them up. Most of the titles, such as the Liber Ivonis and De Vermis Mysteriis, defied his comprehension, but one, the Culte des Ghouls, had sinister connotations. None of these or the other books on the shelves were in languages that he knew, and so, having retrieved his oil lamp and the woman's book, he turned away from the nameless library and glanced at the high conical ceiling. He wondered why someone had fastened to 2 crossbeams above the stone pillar a series of 7 spheres that hung over the figurine, and he did not like the way his eyes lost their focus as he peered at those iridescent globes that caught the refraction of the light from his lantern. Why was the air of the confined room so humid? He did not like the silence of the place, and so he opened the stairway in the crypt and found a page from which to read aloud. He could feel his warm breath hit the hide of his mask and return into his mouth, but his words arose to the 7 spheres of queer radiance, which began to hum as almost indiscernible threads of lightning shot between them. Thunder sounded outside the tower chamber, and with it came the smell of storm. He held his lantern's glow to one of the tall, lean windows, and frowned at the opaque soot with which that window was covered, for the view afforded, if he could have looked through it, would have been interesting. He touched a hand to the thick glass and shivered, for unlike the hot room, the glass was frigid, unnaturally so. Inclining to the window, he blew his breath upon it, and grimaced as the place his hot inhalation touched grew darker still. and then he saw the hazy semblance on that pane of murky glass, the smudge that took on form and became what he first mistook for the reflection of his feminine mask. But when the icon smiled, he sensed that it was other than his false veneer, and when it spoke his name, he was certain. That sound was accompanied with another peal of thunder, and he bent momentarily so as to set lantern and book upon the clean floor of the haunted room. He rose and saw that the image on the window's dusky glass watched him still. How enticing, her mesmeric mouth! How evocatively she murmured his name, like some bewitching lover! How inviting the mirrored moor! How could he refrain from touching his lips to hers? Yet the moment he did so, he realized his error, as his mouth cemented to the ebon window, through which his essence was sucked into the void. 17. I climbed the stony, snow-enshrouded steps that led up the incline of Kingsport's hillside burying ground. Frigid air stung my ears, but I did not mind, for in this quiet place I found solace and escape. I was alone in the place as I climbed to the apex and looked down upon the sleepy seaport town, over the roofs that huddled all around, and the small paned windows that lit up one by one as twilight deepened into dusk. There was no moon, but the gulf of night was a blanket of sparkling stars. It was as I watched those stars that I noticed the dark ethereal form that crept across the sky. I caught my breath and felt afraid, for I had seen this shape in troubled dreaming, a demon that spun like a hungry thing as it coiled nearer to my eyes and stole their light. I shut my eyes and tried to ease my breathing, and when I scanned the skies again, I saw that the demon had altered its shape and was beginning to break apart, and I knew in that instant that there were no deities of rarest air, that such things existed merely in the songs of poets, in the ranting of lunatics and fools. There was nothing but this plot of death, and its quietude, and the unyielding ground on which I stood, as implacable as mundane reality.